Let's begin. Welcome everyone. Bienvenidos to this session of the Mexican Studies Seminar at the CAT Center of the University of Chicago. My name is Emilio Curí. I'm the center's director, and we are very pleased today to have as our presenter Silvia Giorguli, who I think is known to many of us, both here and on the internet. Silvia is honoring us with her presence this quarter as a Tinker visiting professor in the history department. She's a very well-known and distinguished demographer in Mexico, until recently the president of El Colegio de Mexico, and also recently a member of Mexico's El Colegio Nacional. And she is going to give a presentation entitled Mexico's Demographic Paths and Dilemmas. And if you're not familiar with our seminar, the presentation will last approximately 40 minutes. And after that, we will have a little time for questions and comments, both from people who are here with us today and those of you who are online. If you want to ask anything, you'll be welcome to do so. In any case, welcome, Silvia. It's really a pleasure to have you back with us at the CAT Center.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you. It's a pleasure to have you here, and I always appreciate these spaces to share my research and to have these conversations with people with some different backgrounds. So thank you very much. And I also want to thank the CAT Center for Mexican Studies, and especially its director, Emilio Curí, for the opportunity for being here and to present what I will be presenting today. I'm a Tinker visiting professor at the Center for Latin American Studies. Thank you, Claudia and Juan Vicente, and also teaching a class at the Department of History and International Migration in the Americas. But for this presentation for the CAT Center, I'm not going to talk only about migration. I decided to put it in a broader terms. As Emilio has already mentioned, I'm a demographer, so most of my approach to migration also comes from demography. So what I want to present today, it's a large picture of what's going on in terms of demographic trends in Mexico right now. I'll go through the history of Mexico in the last 75 years, as told by its demographic dynamics. And I think that this is also a great input to think about the future. So I will talk a little bit about the future scenarios. Okay, so the way that I decided to present is, first, I want you to look at Mexico within the larger international moment. So right now we are at a very specific time of large demographic changes at an international level. So I'm going to take like 3 slides to talk about the world population trends, and then we will look what's the place of Mexico within this larger and broader picture. And I think it's also a fascinating moment because of the changes. One of the changes at the world level is that 2 years ago, we reached 8 billion inhabitants, 1.5 billion to come in the next 30 years. But if you see, we are starting to reach that moment where the world population will stop growing. No, it will pick up around 10.3 million between 2070 and 2080. And that's a big change in the way we understand demographic dynamics at the international level. It's expected to have this stagnation in the world population. And this has created a lot of debate, the debate regarding on whether it is good or bad, whether this stagnation in the population growth is good or bad for whom. And there are very different perspectives. One is the one that United Nations has been pushing forward. When we reached the 8 billion inhabitants in this planet, that was in October 2022, United Nations launched this report. I was the senior advisor for the report, trying to send the message that 8 billion lives imply 8 billion infinite possibilities of creation, of innovation, But we also know that there's this other rhetoric around population that looks at population growth in a very negative way regarding the challenges that population growth posed. So at this moment, we are at a turning point. The population growth, after a very rapid population growth in the 60s and 70s at the world international level, it started decreasing. Now the population growth is annually below 1%, and it will continue to fall down. And it has also had an impact in terms of the geopolitics. No, it has changed, for example, the way the world looks. Right now, India is already the most populated country. China is having a rapid decrease in its population. The United States will remain as the third most populated countries. And Mexico, which is between the 10 most populated countries, will get out of that list because other countries, especially from Africa and Asia, will continue to grow. So even though we are looking at this context of stagnation, what we have is a combination of certain regions of the world, especially Northern Africa, still growing, others decreasing rapidly, such as China, Japan, some of the European countries, not the US. And the US, it has to do a lot because of the migration into the country. And this has created a lot of rhetoric. I'm going to go very fast on this slide and show you some of the headlines that we got collected from different countries with this stress or anxiety around migration. No, some of them focus still on the rhetoric about overpopulation and rapid population growth, like in Africa, Nigeria. This idea of the population time bomb, which was an idea that Mexico had in the 70s and was very important in changing the rhetoric around population and dynamics in Mexico. It's immoral to have children, whether the planet will be able to sustain the planet, all this growing population. Egypt begging families to have fewer kids. But then we also have this other set of headlines. Do you want to, well, stop. Earth has now 8 billion. Forget overpopulation. Many countries are running out of young people. And a certain demographic anxiety related to this idea of what will come next. With no more bambinos, what will happen to Italy? No, a birth crisis in Italy. Why China's motherhood question looms over the country's long-term future. This part of a decrease in the number of men and women starting life as a couple and having children within the couple. The dangerous low birth rates, the collapse of the US population growth, and etc. No, France's demographic civil war. Without enough Latvians, they won't be Latvia. So what is interesting is that you have at the same time both rhetorics, a rhetoric that is still focused on population growth and a rhetoric that is talking about these very pessimistic views regarding the low fertility. No, and it's very interesting to point that already this is the world map. It's transformed according to the size of the population of each of the countries. And in blue, what you see is all the countries which already have below replacement fertility. That is a fertility rate below 2.1 children per woman. No? So if you look at it, China and India, the most populated countries, already have a very low fertility, a fertility below 2.1. Most of Latin America is already below replacement fertility, including Mexico. And you have Africa as a region that will keep on growing, and certain parts of Asia. So within this broader scenario, where is Mexico? What's happening with the Mexican population? And again, as the same as in the international trends, what we see is that Mexico will stop growing in the next decades. And I'm going to show you a little bit about that. I like this table because it tells the story of Mexico from a demographic perspective, from the 70s all the way to today, 2025. And the last column shows us a little bit of what is coming according to the demographic projections. And I have to say that demographic projections, except for migration, are very stable. No? So, I mean, it maybe changes, but what we are seeing is basically what we expect that will. I mean, it may be a little bit of changes in terms of the levels, but the trends are there. So one of the main issues is this part that I already mentioned. So the Mexican population kept on growing. It will keep growing all the way up to the 2050. But if you see in the 70s, when Mexico changed its population policy, it was growing at a very rapid annual rate, 3%. No, and it started decreasing rapidly. Right now it's below 1%, and it will be 0 by the year 2050. That's where we assume that there will be a stabilization in the Mexican population, a little bit below 150 million, no? And usually this rapid change in population dynamics between 1970 and 1990 is mentioned as one of the most successful state policies. No? The demographic policy was very successful in its goal of decreasing fertility very rapidly. In terms of the population, this is the same graph that you saw for the world population. Now it is only for Mexico. So you see the rapid growth, the most rapid period of growth in the Mexican population was between 1960 and 1980, no? Then it kept on growing, but at a slower pace. And what I already mentioned, that we will probably reach a peak around the year 2050, and then it will start with a very slow decline, no? Very slow decline. And that sort of poses again a question of what does it mean for Mexico to think that in a couple of decades it will start declining. Well, what will be the challenges and how we can anticipate and respond to those challenges. Now, one of the paradox in the way that population change has occurred in Mexico has to do with, fertility decreased very rapidly, but teenage fertility remained high, no? So usually, for example, in Europe, what happened is that fertility decline was related to a delay in the age of marriage and at the age of first birth, no? Women stayed longer in school, or they started working at their teenage years, so they would have kids later in their 20s. And in Mexico, what is happening is that you still have a very important sector of the population that is having children before turning 20, no? And the age at first birth has changed very slowly. And you have a high prevalence of teenage fertility, and we even have around 10,000 annual births of girls between 10 and 14 years of age, which is sort of a contradiction because we have a very modern country in terms of fertility behavior, in terms of number of children per woman, but at the same time, we have a very traditional division with the prevalence of infant marriages and teenage fertility that coexist, and that is high in both rural and urban settings, no? Because we used to think that had to do with the rural-urban divide, but teenage fertility is also high in urban settings, and very similar to the rural teenage fertility. So that's the change in the total fertility rate. In 1970, women in Mexico were having almost 7 children per woman. And look at the change in one cohort to the other, to less than 4 to less than 2. And now it's below replacement, 1.9. And with large differences within states, but all states are converging in a low fertility pattern. For example, Mexico City has a total fertility rate of 1.3, which is very close to that of some Southeast Asian countries, no? And Chiapas, in the southern part of Mexico, which is a country with the highest fertility rate, has a fertility rate of around 2.8. So it's below 3. It's going down, and it will probably reach the level of replacement in this decade. But so there's a difference, but it's not so large in terms of what we used to see in prior decades. And here is the data regarding adolescent fertility rates. Yes, adolescent fertility rates have been declining, but it's still very high given the level of development in Mexico. And I have to say that in the last 10 years, the Mexican government has started a strategy called ENAPEA, the National Strategy to Prevent Teenage Pregnancies, which has had some success in terms of reducing gradually, but in a very small proportion, the teenage fertility rates. So I think that's one of the main challenges regarding the population dilemmas for Mexico in the time to come. The second paradox is that at the same time that Mexico was very successful in reducing mortality, especially infant mortality, and expanding the life expectancy, this century, we have practically seen a stagnation in the gains in life expectancy, especially for men. And it has to do with the violent deaths, no? So, again, if you look, I'm just showing here infant mortality rate, there has been a rapid decrease in infant mortality rates. I have to say, for example, that in Japan, the infant mortality rate is 2 deaths per 1,000 births. No, so we still have way to go from 12 to no, but it has been decreasing. Maternal mortality rates have remained high. For example, when the Millennium Development Goals, one of the goals that Mexico did not comply with has to do with maternal mortality. And during COVID, we saw a very important increase in maternal mortality, which showed us how vulnerable is Mexico in terms of the attention of maternal health, especially in rural areas. And then you have the life expectancy, where there has also been a change. In the 70s. People in Mexico were expected to live 60 years. And it increased by the year 2000, it had reached 74. And after that, if you look at 2025, the gains have been very small. No? And in some states, for example, Chihuahua and Michoacán, there have been no gains, or it's possible some of those states had a reduction in their life expectancy. And this is explained mainly because of the homicides and violent deaths. So that again sort of poses a dilemma. If we think that we want a population policy that increases life expectancy, it's very difficult to think what kind of policies you need to prevent these kind of violent deaths and increase life expectancy. So that's a big challenge that will remain for the years to come. And I have to say that here we are also lagging behind other countries with similar level of development. The other question has to do with this idea of the specific moment that we are living. Like all these changes that I have shown you have shifted the age structure in Mexico. And I'm going to show you an age pyramid that clearly shows this change in age structure. And there's this double discussion on whether we are at a moment of a very good demographic window related to this idea of a demographic dividend, or whether we are at a moment of burden, given that we still have a large population of young people entering the labor market, which may represent a pressure in terms of the labor market. And at the same time, we are already having a rapid population aging. So we still have to respond to the needs of a large bulge of young population and working ages, and a rapid population aging at the same time. This is the population pyramids for Mexico. So you can see how we moved from a young structure in the 70s to, given the decrease in fertility, to this that starts to look more like a trompo de tacos al pastor and stops looking at the pyramid. And but we are at this moment, we still have this very large, the largest cohort is the cohort of young adults between 15, 20, and 40, no? So if you think in a way, you have a moment where you will have the largest cohort of young people working, which, if they find a space to work, may represent a large gain in terms of the dynamism of an economy, no? For example, innovation, etc. And then it should be a moment to prepare for what will come later in terms of aging, no? When this large cohort of young people in their working ages will move to become the elderly by 2070. This is another way of putting it. I like this graph. I will not stop, but for historians, I will not stop and talk a lot in detail. But for historians, I think that this graph also tells very nicely the history of Mexico from 1950 all the way to today, and it's pretty. So what you have is the changes in the population by age group. So the green one is the population below 20, the young population, no? So yeah, we have the 70s and during the 60s and 70s, the most rapid growth in terms of the young population, no? That one below 20 that needed certain type of health services, vaccination, no? Prevention of diarrhea and other chronic other infectious diseases, contagious diseases that were in needed school. There was a lot of pressure in the educational system in terms of the need to respond to this rapid growth of the young population. But that group of population stopped growing in 2011 and it started decreasing. No? So in a way, you may think that for education, Alex, for education, it may be a good moment because you have less pressure on the educational system and probably more time or more resources to focus in other aspects, not only access, but the quality of education. No? That's a possibility. Then you have in purple the second group, that of young adults. That group is now still growing, but it will stop growing by 2030. And is, again, this group that is entering the labor market, looking for housing, starting a family, starting their labor trajectories, and in need of access to higher education and in need of better opportunities regarding housing. No, we have, I mean, we haven't documented it yet, but for example, we're having this process of young people staying longer with their parents because they cannot afford housing by themselves. No, so that's something with when you have the largest cohort of young adults. And I would stress especially the needs in terms of the opportunities that this cohort would need to enter the labor market and fully develop all their potential. Then you have the other adults that are not so young adults, those between 40 to 59. That is also growing, that will reach its peak by 2051. And when we talk about aging, this is the group where we need to focus in terms of prevention and anticipating the effects of aging, no? For example, it's the group that will need attention for chronic diseases, where you can go and prevent issues such as diabetes, which is one of the most important causes of death in Mexico. This is a time to prepare, for example, in terms of economic sustainability in a country where more than half of the working population is in the informal sector and with no access to a pension system. So, so those are two examples. Also in terms of care, no? If you think of these changes in terms of the number of children, my grandmother had 7 kids, children, who would take care of her. At least one of them would take care of her in her old ages. But if you have 2 or none, no. And so there's also this issue of care, which is right now in Mexico leading to a very important discussion on the construction of a national care system. No, it's a discussion going on in Latin America, and Mexico is also pushing forward. And then you have the red group, which is the population 60 and older, that shows the growth of this group, shows the aging of Mexico. It's the group that is growing the most rapidly, no? And if you see that by the end of the 2050s, it will be the largest group. Now let's think what it means for a country to have its largest group in terms of for those 60 and plus. And again, how do you prepare in terms of the kind of health system that you will need to give attention to chronic diseases, care, and economic sustainability of this population? Another way of putting what I have just showed you is the age dependency rates. Now, the age dependency rates is basically, it's very simple. It's the proportion of population in non-working ages, children and population above 60, relative to the working age population, 15 to 59. Oh, to 60, here is to 64, 15 to 64. So when Mexico was growing very rapidly, you almost had one person per not working or not in the working ages per one person in the working ages, no? So as fertility decreased, the age dependency rate decreased. In South Korea, for example, this was a moment when that coincided with a very rapid economic growth, no? And this is mentioned that that's the way this idea of a demographic dividend was created. No, it comes from the experience of Asian countries, in Southeast Asian countries, in particular South Korea. So if we think about the experience of South Korea, Mexico would be right now at this very low point, its lowest point in dependency rates. So Mexico would be right now in this moment of its best point for the demographic dividend, not to capitalize the advantages of the demographic dividend before it starts aging and dependency rates go up again, no? And what we know is that in order to capitalize the demographic dividend, you need to have a prior investment in education. In South Korea, there was a very rapid change in one cohort in terms of gains in educational attainment. You need to have a labor market that is strong and formal, and so that it can capitalize all this labor force, and an economic system that, for example, fosters savings and investment in productive investments. No? So the issue that now the discussion in Mexico is that we didn't prepare in either of those issues. So to some people have this rhetoric that the demographic dividend is already gone, that we didn't do anything to capitalize it. I think that it's a very pessimist perspective. I think that we will still have low dependency rates for a couple of decades more, and there is something to be done in terms of investment, not only in young adults, but also in lifelong, what they call lifelong learning, no? Investment in the adult years, not only in at the young ages. So while I already mentioned this, there's still time to capitalize the demographic dividend. I tend to think yes, that it's possible. And the other large question, the other big question is whether we are prepared for the challenges of rapid aging in the years to come, in terms of what it will mean to access to health, access to economic sustainability, family support when fertility is declining, and this discussion regarding the role of the state as provider of care for the elderly. So those are some of the demographic dilemmas on both sides in terms of capitalizing the demographic dividend, but in also anticipating the challenges related to rapid aging in the years to come. And so, yeah, and this would be the last part. So when we talk about demography, we talk about fertility, mortality, and migration. So migration is the most difficult one to project, to anticipate. In fact, we usually are not very confident about the projections on migration because it changed rapidly. In fact, I'm going to show you a couple of graphs of how it has changed in Mexico. But migration is one of the components that has defined the demographic dynamics in Mexico. No, we can think whether Mexico has sent too many migrants outside of the country, and we have some of them here. There's now the idea, and you see it in the news, that Mexico is receiving too many immigrants. For some of you shall see the headlines. And there's also the issue of return migration. Migration in Mexico keeps having this double side, the direction of those coming and going. So I'm going to just show you a couple of graphs regarding international migration and what it has meant for Mexico. This is a graph of the number of Mexicans living in the United States. So again, from the perspective of historians, it's a very old process. Mexican migration to the US is something that you can trace back even to the 19th century, and that had remained low, and that has to do because there was a lot of circular migration, no? And that it was in the 70s, but especially in the 80s and 90s, when you see that big increase in the number of Mexicans living in the US. My colleague Douglas Massey says that the revolving door was closed with restrictive policies in the US, but was closed for the return to Mexico, not for the entry. People kept on arriving, and the Mexicans kept on arriving, but were not able to return given the restrictive policies and the control of immigration in the US. So these 70s and the 80s also coincides with the largest demographic period in terms of growth, the entry of these young cohorts into the labor force in the 80s and 90s. And then we see this sudden stagnation in terms of the size of the Mexican population in the US. I think there's still a debate regarding the reasons. I don't know if Andreas may have a hypothesis. So some ideas had to do with it coincides with the Great Recession, with the number of deportations during the Obama period, with the change in the demographic dynamics in Mexico, which also may have contributed, although the change is so rapid that it's difficult to think. So right now, well, that's 2023, but 2025, it's about the same. The population, the number of Mexicans, people born in Mexico living in the US, is below 12 million. It hasn't grown since around 2009. And it represents around 8% of the total population, the total Mexican population, 8%. No? If you think that for countries like El Salvador, is 24% of its population living abroad, For Jamaica, is more than 30% of its population living abroad. So 8%, I don't know if you may think that it's too much or it's too little, but just to put it in perspective. Now, if you add the second generation, that are Mexicans also by right, that can have the citizenship, then it would represent around 14% of the total population. No? And if you add the third generation of lost, well, that would also imply a lot. So we can think that, in fact, the number of Mexicans moving to the US did have a demographic impact in the demographic trends or the size of the population in the US. Now, what I was saying, that how rapidly it changes, I'm just going to show you, I already showed you how it changed the size of the population. Now what I'm going to show you, this graph represents the annual entries of Mexico into the US. How many Mexicans enter the US every year? No? So again, you see these peaks by the year 2000 and 2004. Just imagine in 1 year, 760,000 Mexicans arrived in the US and stayed to live here. That was in the year 2000. And then after 2004, it started decreasing. Again, it has to do with the Great Recession when it reached its lowest. And it remained low all during the last decade. And in the last years, we have seen an increase, a little bit of an increase. Still, we are very far from what we saw at the beginning of at the turning of the century, no? But there are some trends that tell us that Mexican migration to the US may be increasing with very different characteristics, because we have a large component of documented migration. No, for example, when we have this period of a return migration between 2008 and 2015, a lot of that return migration was documented migrants. No, because in the time of economic strain in the US, they were the ones that had the possibility of going back to Mexico and planning on returning to the US when conditions changed. Now, the other question is whether Mexico has too many immigrants. We know that Mexico has traditionally been an in-transit country. But when you look at the number of foreign-born population living in the US, it's less than 1%. In the US, it's 16%. The foreign-born population represents 16%. In Canada, it represents 22%. In Mexico, it's less than 1%. But the data that I like of this table is that its largest migration group comes from people born in the US, no? Which represents, it's 0.6 of its population. But if you see, it's far from the other countries, Guatemala, Venezuela, Colombia, and Honduras, no? So when people ask me like whether is Mexico really becoming a country of immigration, well, right now we are having an intercensal survey that will tell us whether it has increased. But even if it doubled, it's very low regarding the size of the country. No, that's my perception. The other part is that we do remain as a country of return. And there was a large return migration, again, related to the Great Recession. And then it decreased, but it has remained, I mean, it's something that still exists in the country. So, and has to do with this consolidation of all the linkages of a large Mexican community in the US, of this documentation status that allows people to come back and forward, for example, move back to Mexico when a relative is sick and then return to the US when they need. And the other question has to do with the in-transit migration. So as I mentioned, Mexico has been an in-transit migration for a long time. So what would be the changes recently? Well, first, the large increase in the number of in-transit migrants. So we don't have a way of measuring in-transit migration. What we use are the encounters or apprehensions by the Mexican authority and the US authority. No, I'm just showing you here the graph of the apprehensions by Mexican authorities and how they increase rapidly in the last years, and with a component of men and women, but mainly men, and also with very rapid changes in terms of the countries of origin. I didn't want to put you the whole table because it's very big with a lot of numbers. So I'm just showing the data for 2024 for the full year. So you have Venezuela, Ecuador, Honduras, Guatemala, Colombia, Colombia, but probably if we had looked at 2022 or 2021, the largest groups may have been Honduras, Salvadorans, and Guatemalans. So it changed very rapidly from one year to the other. And the other thing that we are seeing is an increase in the number of extracontinental in-transit migrants. So it's only you have these peaks of people from Senegal, for example, or from China, from India, from Ukraine, no? And that is also new. And the other thing that has changed is the age profile of the in-transit migrants, no? If in-transit migrants used to be mainly adults, given that this migration is related to the needs for humanitarian protection, it has also changed the profile, and it means families moving together and a larger presence of children in the flow, which is something that we're gonna see today in class. Okay, so yeah, to conclude, as I mentioned, I think that it's a fascinating moment because there's a large change in demographic dynamics in Mexico. We have demographic dynamics that cross the prevailing inequalities, although we have a convergence, for example, in terms of fertility. We still have those challenges I mentioned: teenage fertility, teenage marriages, maternal mortality, the difficulty in reducing violent deaths, the challenge of how to seize the demographic dividend and anticipate the challenges related to rapid aging, and questions regarding migration, whether U.S. migration will remain low, whether Mexico will become a country of reception of international migrants and it stops growing, and if migration to the U.S. also remains low, and how to implement a coherent humanitarian approach to the management of migration, which is something that I didn't put in detail because I will be talking next week at the conference with class. And that would be all. Thank you very much for your attention.
We have some time for questions. Thank you, Silvia. Thank you. We have, I want to say, while we get ready for your questions, and if you're here, just raise your hand. If you're on Zoom, just raise your hand on Zoom, and we'll give you a chance. But I just want to say, it's really fascinating and clarifying, and I think that when people, at least in this university, think about the social sciences, they don't think about demography, as much as they should, because it is such a profoundly sort of clarifying set of, materials that allow us to put a lot of things in perspective, allows in and of itself to really understand what things seem to be issues but are not. So that was a wonderful, not just a wonderful presentation, but also a very powerful case in favor of the importance of demography and demographic studies as part of social scientific analysis. And with that, I'll open the floor for your questions here or on Zoom.
Well, I have great presentation. Really, as I said, clarifying a lot of issues. But with these returning migrants, which is going to become an issue in the sense of what are they coming to? Because there are there's no work, there's not enough, I think, possibilities in some of these small towns where maybe 60% of the male population is already in the US, and now they're coming back. That's, I think, an incredible challenge and what can be done. And the other thing is that will create also an issue from the money that's coming into Mexico. That is coming from these people that are now returning migrants. So is there something that they're doing about that? Because it's going to create the fact that you have all these people, and now that you don't have the revenue coming from the people living here.
That one by one. Okay. Yeah. No. Thank you for your comments. So there are several things when we talk about return migrants. First, for example, with the deportations during the Obama period, we have a lot of return migration that was forced. So you have to distinguish between voluntary and forced returns. And the other part is like some of these deportations were of people that had left Mexico 10, 15 years ago. No, some of them were very young. They didn't They didn't have any, for example, school experience in the US. They were totally disconnected. They did not necessarily return to the communities of origins of their parents, but many of them remain in the border cities and in other large cities such as Monterrey and Mexico, especially in Mexico City. No, so it's a different kind of return, like the one that we would think about in the 80s and 90s, of people coming and going between the same community of origin and destination. So of course, it poses a lot of challenges, and Mexico has had these different programs like the Programa Paisano, Vuelve a México, to support returned migrants. But when you talk with migrants, basically, and on a project that we had right before the pandemics, the migrants will say, like, what we need is a way to identify ourselves, because we need a form of identification to rent a house, to file an application for a job, to get registration for health services. No, so that would be like the first thing. And the other, well, yeah, like help in terms of navigating the complex bureaucracies in Mexico, especially when you don't have, if you're not returning to your family of origin, that may help you navigate and tell you, oh, well, this is what you need to do. If you need to get a doctor, go over here. If you need to get a job, I suggest you go and visit them. Now, if you don't have those strong family networks that used to be in the other forms of return, then you have to look for them in some other ways, and public policies can be an option for assertively reintegrating return migrants. So you have a combination. You do have this traditional return migration of people coming and going. That's something that we found with the research on the Mexican Migration Project, is that is largely documented. As I mentioned, people saying, well, I'm having a divorce, so I'm going back to my community of origin for some years, or I have teenage kids who are starting to get involved with the gangs here, so I'm going to my community of origin. My parents are sick, I'm going back to take care for some time, and then I will go back. But that is something that documented migrants can do, not those who have a permanent residency or citizenship. And they do go back to their communities of origin. And then you have this other pattern of return migration, young people who left the country when they were very young, are returning to a country that they didn't, that they don't know. No, there's a group, an organization in Mexico that is called Dreamers in Action, and they call themselves Dreamers in Action because we are the dreamers that were not able to stay, that were deported. But yeah, when you visit them, they speak in English. They have a lot of job opportunities in participating, for example, in call centers or in touristic areas, because they speak English fluently as native speakers. No, but yeah, so that would be like the recent patterns. And in terms of remittances, so remittances remain as a very important source of income for Mexico. No, I don't remember the proportion of its GDP that it represents, but it's but it's like the second main source of income for the country, and at certain times the first one. No, it depends, and there's a question of, well, for how long can people keep on remitting? No. For example, for how long, whether the second generation will keep on remitting or not, no? Or if you have all your family already living with you in the US and you have parents, but at a certain point you will stop sending money back because, no? So yeah, a colleague of mine, Agustin Escobar, says that that's something that we cannot keep on relying on remittances. But it has created a lot of debate in Mexico. For example, there was this idea that we needed to direct remittances for productive investments and for local development, not something that also the World Bank and the IDB, the International Development Bank, and ideas that they also pushed. Mexico used to have this program called Tres por Uno. I don't know if you have heard, no? When for every dollar that a migrant may send back for social infrastructure or productive projects at the community level, the state government and the federal government would put another one, and in some cases even the municipality will put another one. So in some states you have 4 por uno, in others 3 por uno, no? But yeah.
Thank you. Other questions? Andreas and then
Alex.
Yeah.
Do you have a sense of what is going on with the ones with the pilots of people stuck, or the ones who wanted to come to the US and now they cannot, and still not to come? And we're on the way and got stuck in Mexico. We have any idea what's going on with them? They can return to the country of origin. Are they thinking about staying in Mexico? And relatedly, the related question for the things many of the countries, especially the region, that are facing huge crises like Haiti or Ecuador, are going to basically make it to Mexico, knowing that they cannot make it to the US, knowing that they need to be, and many countries in the region are going to turn to the right, for instance, Chile, Ecuador. So the space of that system is going to shrink. It makes it still has capacity to absorb.
Yeah. So
Speculation,
no, yet. So it's this idea of those who were trapped in Mexico when there was this change in the migration policy, that they have the expectation. Many of them were waiting for their appointments and no. And so as I mentioned, it's so difficult to measure this in-transit migration because most of it is undocumented or irregular. They don't want to be counted, and it's no. So what we do have is the approach in terms of apprehensions that they have decreased largely. But it's impressive, the decrease in the number of apprehensions by U.S. authorities and by Mexican authorities, which sort of tell us that there has been a dissuasion in terms of the people crossing. Now we see that in terms of the albergues that have less people, and so less people is arriving. No, that's one. Whether people is returning or not, as you mentioned, it depends returning where, no? Because if you are from Haiti or from Cuba, it's so difficult to think that they have the option of returning. There have been some programs, some interesting programs by UNCHR and by IOM. For example, the Spanish government has pushed also an employment program for migrants in transit, trying to create options for employment at certain specific places, especially in the southeast of Mexico. No, to what extent they have been successful in retaining people there, we don't know. And to what extent people decide to remain in Mexico, given that also Mexico is in a very difficult economic situation and in terms of violence in many of the states. We don't know, but we will know with the encuesta intercensal that is being conducted right now. And I saw yesterday an article interviewing Tonatiuh Guillén, the former commissioner of the National Institute on Migration, saying that on research that he's conducted, he found that people was switching their expectations, and a large proportion of those trapped were deciding to stay in Mexico. No, but that's something I read 2 days ago. And we will need to ask Tonatiuh to know more about it.
You and then Brody.
Sure. Thank you for the presentation. The idea of the demographic dividends is interesting, and I wonder to what extent conversations are had in those terms when discussing these other sort of programs that have social benefits beyond this kind of demographic imperative, and the potential for optimism in the future. What do you think are things that could be done that would take advantage of this 2-decade, 3-decade moment?
Yeah, I tend to be optimistic, but the evidence is not supporting my optimism. But in fact, for example, in 2000, Fox, we did an analysis of the national development plans and how the demographic variable was considered or not in the projections for the following 6 years. No? And Fox did include the reference to the demographic dividend and did include mentioning the importance of capitalizing the moment. No? I mean, from rhetoric to actual implementation, there's a large gap, not like from setting it in the public agenda to turning it into efficient policies. It's a big distance, and it didn't happen. But in the followings, it was not even mentioned at all. With the current administration, it has set some demographic goals, one around teenage pregnancy and maternal mortality. And it's at this moment, I suppose probably by the end of November, they will release a national strategy on aging, no? But they have focused more on that on the demographic dividend, no? I think that, and as you mentioned, it's something that needs to be taken into account with educational policies, labor policies, well, so it needs an intersectoral approach.
Thank you. Brody?
I have a couple of questions that are probably indicative of my ignorance of the field of demography and my training as a student and anything else. But I guess the first, which is most in that category, is I was thinking about the predictions about when population is going to peak. And I was wondering if we were to go back about 10 years and look at the predictions from 10 years ago, have they changed? In other words, sort of how variable are the predictions sort of based on time, and to what extent do you think that the projections for the future are likely to be reliable, especially given sort of transformations that might come from things like, you know, immigration crackdowns that go beyond what we've seen before, or climate change events, or, you know, the rest of it? How confident are you in those? My second question just has to do with something you didn't talk about. I'm really curious about demographic changes in Mexico having to do with race, and whether that's something that's measurable, and if so, what's happening sort of to the racial and ethnic makeup of the Mexican population. And then the last question, and don't feel obliged to answer all of these, we can talk later as well, but I was really curious about the interplay between the age structures that you're showing for the Mexican population and the question of migration. And first, I wasn't clear when you were talking about the age structure of the Mexican population, whether that's including Mexicans who are living in the United States or not. And then I was curious whether things like fertility rates, infant mortality rates, whether those are greater in U.S. Mexican populations or Mexican resident Mexican populations, and generally what migration is doing to the age structure graphs that you showed us, which were so beautifully constructed.
Okay. So I will answer. No, very, very good questions. First, I have to say that with the projections, there is a very close relationship between the official statistics and academics, no? Gustavo Cabrera was the first one to work in the first projections that it was very interesting because with Echeverría in 1970, he started with this idea of gobernar es poblar, no? That we need to populate the country. And by 72, 73, he changed to this idea, oh, we need to control fertility, no? And it was projections made by demographers, by in academia, by Gustavo Cabrera and Raúl Benítez, who when he got the statistics and he got it, that was the change, no? And the projections for the last 15 years have been conducted between the Mexican government and El Colegio de Mexico. So I tend to because we have participated in the discussion. And they have been very accurate. Of course, the good thing that in Mexico, because we have the census data every 10 years and the intercensal survey, that it's close to a census, but shorter. It's in terms of the number of questions. It allows us to update them every 5 years, no? So yeah, there are some changes. These last projections, the ones that are based on the 2020 census, were more complicated because of COVID, no? So we needed to wait for some time to see the impact of COVID on mortality. And basically what we saw is the same that we saw in most of the countries in the world. Yeah, there was a decrease in life expectancy between 2020 and 22, but by 2023, it had already returned to its the same trend, as before. So that is something interesting, I think, in terms of the collaboration, and we also have a lot of discussions with UN, because many countries rely on UN for UN does the projections. In the case of Mexico, because we have a very solid national statistics of someone who was also a Tinker Fellow, Graciela Marcas, who is now the head of the INEGI. And so we do our own projections, and then we compare them with the ones with the United Nations. And they're not exactly the same, but they are very similar. No, so that's also a way of thinking that they are reliable. And regarding the impact of migration, the potential impact of migration is where we can see, because as I mentioned, COVID did decrease life expectancy, but it recovered by 2023, it had recovered, no, its level. So in terms of migration, yeah, it would need to be like a very large exodus, something similar to what is happening in Venezuela. No, in Venezuela, yes, of course, Venezuela has lost 30% of its population, even higher, according to the book that Andreas coordinated with Jorge Duran and Xochitl and Stephanie Schutz. So if with something like that, it would have an impact on demographic dynamics. No, but if it remains as stable as it has been, there's a large question regarding the increase of forced displacement related to violence. In my opinion, I think that this increase in the number of Mexicans moving to the US is also related to forced migrations related to violence, no? But also we know that has a larger effect in terms of internal displacements. And I didn't talk at all about internal migration, but that is something that of course. And regarding race and demographic dynamics, yeah, well, we can see, because again, with the census data, we have two ways of studying ethnic differences: by indigenous origin and by Afro descendants. No. And I expect that there will be, especially regarding the indigenous population, differences. But as I haven't done it for indigenous and non-indigenous population, but I have done it for states. And again, we see this convergence. So yeah, I suppose that there will remain high inequalities regarding, for example, fertility and teenage marriage, but that the trend is to decline and converge into what we are seeing for the mean. And in terms of age structure and migration, yeah, it does not include the Mexican population in the US. But Mexico and the US look very similar in many of their demographic indicators. No, for example, fertility is higher in the US than in Mexico. I mean, they are very similar. No, in Mexico is 1.9, in the US is 2.0, or something like that. But they are very similar. And what we have found is that in terms of fertility, the Mexican population tends to integrate to the trends seen in the US in the medium term. No? So I know that there's a large debate regarding the high fertility of Hispanic or Latino migrants and whether that can create demographic imbalances. That's part of the discussion that we're going to see today also in class. But when you look at it, not in the short term, right after arrival, but in the medium and long term, the migrant populations Latino migrant populations tend to integrate. I don't know if it would be correct here to talk as assimilate, no, to the mainstream in terms of fertility in the US. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Well, we are out of time. I just want to finish by thanking you, Silvia. I think this was a really thought-provoking presentation, and a clear reminder, as if we needed one, of how fortunate we are to have you here at the University of Chicago. So thank you, and thank you all for joining us very much. We hope to see you again next time. Bye-bye.